Hello everyone, today let's solve the problem number 626, exchange seat. So what the question states here, we are given a table seat. So you can clearly see here, we are given a table seat with a column name ID and student, right? So you can clearly see here, ID and student. So ID is of the type integer and student is of the type varchar, right? So that's what they have mentioned here. So ID is the primary key here, unique value column for this table. Each row of the table indicates the name and ID of the student, right? So just keep this in mind. The ID sequence always starts from 1 and increments continuously. So that's what they have given here. You can clearly see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So I hope this is completely clear. So what is our main task here, or what is our main goal here? What we need to do, basically we have to write a solution to swap the seat ID. So we have to write the solution to swap the seat ID of every 2 consecutive students. So this is very important. Write a solution to swap the seat ID of every 2 consecutive students. So this is very important. That's what we need to do, right? So if the number of students is odd, the ID of the last student is not swapped. So if the number of student is odd, then the ID of the last student is not swapped in this case, right? So I hope this is completely clear. The question is completely clear. So let's come to the example 1 here, whatever they have given here. So just give me a second here in this case. So yeah, let's discuss the example 1 or the first example in this case. So we have the seat table here with the column name ID and student as I have mentioned in the question, right? So here in this case, what we have to do, we have to swap the 2 consecutive IDs right here. In this case, 1 we have Abbott, whatever, however you pronounce, this doesn't matter. I'll just call this one as Abbott, right? So 2 there is Doris. So I'll just consider D here. For the Abbott, I'll consider A, and for the Doris, I'll consider D in this case, right? So here we need to swap the people, or we need to swap the student here, right? So for 1, this will be Doris, and 2, it will be Abbott here, right? For 1, it will be this one, Doris, and for 2, it will be Abbott when we swap. So when we swap, right? So this is what happens when we swap. And for 3, we have to swap with 4. Nothing but in this case, 3 we are having Emerson, and 4 we are having Green here in this case. 3, 4, 3 we are having Emerson, and 4 we are having Green here in this case. When we swap, what happens here? 3 will be Green in this case, and 4 will be Emerson in this case, right? So 4 will be Emerson in this case. So 5, here we have James, right? So James or James, however you pronounce. So here 5 we have James. This guy remains unchanged because it's the last odd ID. So when explaining the question, I had explained the same, right? When explaining the question, I had explained the same, right? So what did I say? If the number of the students is odd, the ID of the last student is not swapped. So here in this case, we have 5. So 5 is odd, right? So total number of students, ID of the students is odd here in this case. 5 is odd. So the last student is not swapped in this case. So this James or James, however you pronounce, that guy remains unchanged, the final one, right? So he remains unchanged in this case. So in this case, 5 will be this one, James, right? So I hope this is clear, right? So that's what we need to do here on this case. So output here is for 1, now for 1 we have Doris, for 2 we have Abbott, for 1 Doris, for 2 Abbott, for 3 we have Green, for 4 we have Emerson, for 3 here we have Green, for 4 we have Emerson, and for 5, as it is odd, so total number of ID here, student ID, total number of ID times with the odd, right? Total we have 5. So 5 is odd. So the last one, the last ID remains unchanged in this case. So 5 will be James itself in this case, right? So 5 will be James in this case. So ID is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is what we need to return. So ID and student, just we need to swap, right? So that's what they have asked in the question. I hope the question is completely clear. What we need to do is completely clear as well. So here in the explanation, they have given same thing. Note, if the number of students is odd, there is no need to change the last one's seat, right? So that's what I had explained, right? So now what we will do, let's discuss the approach and then let's write the query. So here in the first step, if the ID is even, then we have to swap it with the previous ID. So we know this one. If the ID is even, then we have to swap it with the previous ID. Nothing but here in this case, sorry, just give me a second here. So here when the we have to swap it with the previous ID when the ID is even, right? So ID minus 1, swap it with the previous ID, right? So that's what we discussed in the example one. Same thing we will be doing. So if the ID is odd and not the last ID, so here when I say when the ID is odd and not the last ID, we will swap it with the next ID. So this will be ID plus 1. So the previous one was ID minus 1. This will be ID plus 1. If the ID is odd and not the last ID, then we will swap it with the next ID, right? So this will be ID plus 1. So if the ID is even, then we will swap it with the previous ID minus 1 in this case, right? So here this will be ID plus 1, ID minus 1 and ID plus 1. Let's move on with the third step here. If it's the last odd ID, then we will keep it unchanged. This one we have already discussed in the example, in the first example, right? We had odd IDs, 5 IDs we had, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So fifth one, James, if you remember, right? James or James, however you call, that guy remained unchanged, right? So here, that's what, if it's the last ID, we will keep it unchanged. So the last one is we have to order by the ID. So we have to try to maintain the original order or the ascending order basically. So it starts with 1 and increments with 2, 3, 4, 5, increment by 1. It increments with 1, right? So that's what while explaining the question I had explained the same thing. ID I am speaking of, right? So we have to maintain the original order. In this case, order by ID I have said. So I hope this is clear. These are the 4 steps that we have to go with, or this is the approach that we'll be going with mainly. So first one is if the ID is even, we saw this one, ID minus 1. If the ID is odd and not the last ID, then we will be swapping with the next ID, ID plus 1. The third one is if it's the last this one odd ID, then we have to keep it unchanged. And the fourth one here is order by ID. We have to maintain the original order in this case, right? So this is the approach that we have to, this is the approach that we'll be going with. As we are familiar with the approach, as we know the approach now, it will be easier to write the query. Let's start writing the query. First, what I'll do, if the ID is even, we have to assign it to the previous ID, right? So first, let me go with the select keyword here. Sorry, what is happening here? Yeah, this one, let me consider here case, right? So let me make use of the case keyword that is provided by the SQL. So first step here is if ID is even, we have to assign it to the previous ID. Nothing but ID minus 1, if you remember. That's what we have to implement or articulate the same thing in the form of query. So I'll just make use of the when keyword. When ID, I'll just give your ID module 2. Nothing but even, right? So ID module 2 equals 0. Then I'll just make use of the then keyword that is provided by the SQL here. Then it is ID minus 1. We know this one from the approach, right? So if the ID is odd, then and not the last one, means not the last one, means if the ID is not the last one and if it is odd, then we have to assign it to the next ID, nothing but ID plus 1, right? That one also we have to articulate that one in the form of query or implement that one in the form of query. So I'll just give here when ID module 2 equals 1, means odd in this case. I'll just make use of the AND keyword here. If ID less than, so ID less than, here in this case, I'll be going with select. I'll just make use of the max keyword here, max of ID, right? So this is coming from the seat table, right? So I'll just make use of seat here. Then as it is odd, we'll be going with the ID plus 1. We have already discussed this one in the approach, right? So this is fine. So if it's the last odd ID, so in this example itself, in the first example, if it is the last this one odd ID, then we have to keep it unchanged, right? So this will not change anything here. In this case, what I'll do, I'll just give here else let me give ID, right? This is fine. So the next step here is we will give end as id. So this is fine, comma student here. In this case, this is coming from seat table as well, right? So we have to order, or we have to sort based on the id here. So we have to sort this one based on the id in the ascending order, right? So I'll just make use of order here in this case, right? So let me do one thing. Let me hit enter here. So after seat, let me do one thing. Let me make use of order by class here id. So this is it for the query. Let me hit the run button. I hope this works. Let's see. So here you can clearly see the sample test case is getting passed. Means the query works absolutely correct, right? So let's see whether this works for all the test cases or not. So I have hit the submit button. Let's wait for some time. So you can clearly see all the test cases are getting passed. Means the query works absolutely correct on this case, right? So I hope whatever the query that we have written is completely clear as well. For now, this is it. Thanks for watching, guys.